Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's meeting. My name is Jennifer Reed, and I'm with the American Institutes for Research. Before we begin today, I just need to let you know that the American Institutes for Research allows for the recording of audio, visual, participants, and other information sent, verbalized, or utilized during our business meetings. Video and audio recordings of any AIR session shall not be transmitted to an external third party without permission. By joining the meeting today, you do automatically consent to such recording. At this time, I would like to introduce Greg Core, the Division Director with the Office of Special Education Programs and the Monitoring and State Improvement Planning Division. Greg?
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome everyone. I'm pleased to introduce our first monthly webinar for DMS 2.0. We're excited to launch our new process for monitoring and providing support to our state partners in order to assist you with improving student and child outcomes, as well as programmatic compliance. I want to thank Matt Schneer and Diana Yu for spearheading this effort, and Kate Moran, who has joined more recently as our DMS implementation team facilitator. So welcome, Kate. And certainly want to thank the members of our DMS implementation team who've been working so hard recently to stand up this new process. This webinar is both for the cohort 1 states, but also it is conceptualized as universal TA. So we welcome anybody, any of our state partners, to the webinar today, regardless of the cohort that you might be in. I think you'll all find it beneficial. So without further ado, we have a lot of content to get through this afternoon. I'm going to turn it over to Matt Schneer. Matt?
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate the kind introduction. I want to echo Greg's thanks to Diana and to Kate and the DMS implementation team. I also want to thank the members of today's panel, which come from our fiscal implementation team. I'm Matthew Schneer, and I'm one of the Associate Division Directors, most of you from maybe before, and I talk today wearing kind of two hats. One, for a long time, I've been working with the fiscal implementation team, and we've done a lot on fiscal monitoring in the past. And I'm also, as Greg mentioned, been working very hard on our new DMS 2.0 and working with that team to do that. So I am pleased to welcome you to the first in the series, as Greg mentioned, of our DMS national TA calls. We're planning to have these every month. And the concept would be that we will be providing universal TA on these national TA calls that is in alignment with the monitoring activities that we're conducting with cohort 1 states. So as Greg said, this is not just for states that are currently in cohort 1, but we believe this information will be helpful to you in preparing for whenever you are going to be involved in the DMS monitoring process, whatever cohort you are in, as well as just general TA that we think will help you improve your system. So we're very excited for this. As we move forward, we'll be interested in your feedback on the universal TA we're providing and anything else you might be interested in. I also just want to quickly note that we have been working to collaborate with our TA center partners to try to make sure that the best technical assistance available is available to you and to try to coordinate what we're doing. So I think this is the first in this effort, but we'll continue to make it better. Finally, I just want to mention that I have had a chance to be on a few DMS calls over this last week, and I've really been impressed with the collaborative and open approach that states seem to be taking to the process, as well as my fellow OSEP members on this. We think that this new monitoring process will help move the field in a positive direction, and we're looking forward to collaborate with you. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Kate, who's going to talk about what we're going to see on today's webinar and provide you with some additional information about DMS 2.0. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I want to echo what both Greg and Matt have shared. We're very excited to kick off our work related to DMS 2.0, and we hope to walk through the first component, which is fiscal monitoring today. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jen, that would be great. So today's agenda and objectives that we hope to walk through is a brief overview of the overall DMS 2.0 process. We've talked about that on a separate TA call, but we just wanted to take a little time today to circle back to some of the main components that we walked you through then as a reminder of where we are in this process and a few updates that we have related to that. We'll then move into a discussion related to the single line of responsibility, the SLOR monitoring protocol, which is closely linked to our Part C programs. We'll be summarizing the introduction document, including a walkthrough of the related requirements of that document and the key components in the SLOR protocol. We'll end out the call today summarizing the IDEA Part B Fiscal Subrecipient Monitoring protocol, and again reviewing those key components of that protocol that we want to draw your attention to as we're working through our DMS process. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jen. So again, we have 8 key components. You'll just want to hit the button. I think they'll pop up. There we go. So our puzzle pieces that we're going to be walking through over our DMS 2.0 process cover 8 key components. So it's fiscal management, we've got integrated monitoring, sustaining compliance and improvement, implementation of policies and procedures, technical assistance and professional development, dispute resolution, data, and SPP APR. And again, we're going to be covering these components over this first year. We call that phase 1. We'll also be circling back to those in phase 2. And then the third year, we'll be working on closing out any areas that we might have findings or issues that we've uncovered through phase 1 and phase 2. If you want to go to the next slide. So this first year, we have our cohort 1 states who are engaging in the first phase of our monitoring process. And this first year deals with our pre-site work and preparation. So we consider this kind of our discovery year where OSEP will be taking the majority of the lift of the work. So we'll be utilizing some protocols that we've outlined on those 8 key components. And we'll be collecting information that we can that's publicly available and then setting up calls with states so that we could delve a little deeper, perhaps request some additional documentation. We'll have some clarifying conversations. We'll be verifying the information that we find so we can ensure that our understanding is clear of your system. If you want to go to the next slide, Jen. So this next slide will look a little bit different from what we discussed on our national TA call. OSEP really wanted to be mindful and responsive to stakeholders on concerns that were raised in that original phase 1 schedule that we had outlined. We felt like with the current pandemic and the workload that states are dealing with, that we wanted to look at how we are reviewing our 8 key components during this first year. And as such, we made a few revisions to that schedule. So integrated monitoring, sustaining compliance and improvement will be moved to January and February. Fiscal, our fiscal management component will be beginning that in October and November. We'll have December as a catch-up and carryover month, and then we'll move into the integrated monitoring and sustaining compliance and improvement protocols, again, with OSEP taking that first step at looking at the information and reaching out to states to have some calls to clarify that information. In March and April, we're going to move to the implementation of policies and procedures, technical assistance, and professional development. May and June, we'll now be covering dispute resolution, and we've moved our data and SPP APR to July and August, leaving September for our preparation work for phase 2 and for any outstanding areas that we might have throughout this year, because again, we have the full year to cover all these different topics. Our goal is that this structure will allow us ample time and the appropriate space to work and discuss the various components in our DMS process with you, our states. All right, Jen, if you want to move to the next slide. So this is where we are right now, October, November. We're talking about fiscal management, and today we're going to walk through the Part C, single line of responsibility, and Part B, subrecipient monitoring protocols. Next slide. So Charlie, I think, is going to unmute and talk us through a little bit related to the fiscal monitoring of unitary systems. We want to make sure that folks understand that we're mindful of the nuances. So Charlie, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Well, first of all, I'll just start by saying that we are aware that the existing protocols that we're going to talk about today, the ones for the single line of responsibility and for the subrecipient monitoring, are not great fits for the unitary systems, as they don't have LEAs or necessarily early childhood programs, right, separate from the lead agency. So this is something we've been aware of. We've been working prior to DMS 2.0 on refining our monitoring to better reflect the needs of those entities. So this is something that's well underway, and we hope that you're going to hear something from us soon that, similar to the, I hate calling it the SLOR, but the SLOR or the Part C, Part B monitoring, they can be used as a self-assessment as well while you're waiting to be monitored. I would also point out, we continue to have a very high level of, commitment for our outlying areas and freely associated states, and look forward to working with you through that self-assessment process as well. I think what you'll find as a focus for just generally speaking, for the unitary systems is a focus on cross-cutting requirements from the OMB uniform guidance. So if you want to get a start now, we'll be looking at some of those things that most impact special ed programs and early intervention programs. So we'll be looking at, your systems for personnel, for example, that, would be a nice tie-in to the grant application, or looking at records management. We're going to want to look at monitoring of the program by the agency or by the government, depending on the entity that we're discussing. So just give you a quick preview there, but stay tuned, and we hope to get back with you soon about that. So from here, I think we are moving to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the single line of responsibility, and I think you have Susan Kaufman on the line to discuss the next couple slides with you.
Yes, thank you, Charlie.
Sure.
All right, so we're going to start this off by talking about the DMS 2.0 Part C fiscal monitoring. I want to thank Matt and Kate and everyone who's worked so hard on this. And we want to start by telling you a little bit about how the Part C monitoring became the single line of responsibility. As most of you will recall, based on a risk assessment used to determine intensive, targeted, or universal levels of support, our previous DMS IGA Part C fiscal monitoring examined how state lead agencies were consistently implementing their system of payment policies and, if applicable to your systems, the methods that established financial responsibility for the provision of Part C services with other state-level public agencies that pay for or provide Part C services. We had many Part C lead agencies that took part in these activities. And you can go to the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm on slide 10. I have no visual today. So based on going from DMS to DMS 2.0, we learned a lot. We had several years and several Part C lead agencies that we conducted the IDA Part C fiscal monitoring activities with. From those activities, the discussions, the results, and the findings, we as OSEP identified a need to shift our monitoring to include the required fiscal authorities under the lead agency's single line of responsibility. Although we started out our fiscal monitoring with a focus on the system of payments and methods, the implementation of those throughout the state, we began identifying findings that were specific to the lead agency's single line of responsibility authority. If you were part of the cohort of states from the original DMS group, you may remember this. Some of the findings and the results that we were coming up with were specific to effective systems for general supervision and monitoring over the IDA Part C fiscal requirements, the assignment of financial responsibility, the development of policies and procedures to ensure timely service provision, the resolution of intra and intra-agency disputes, geographic equity by not charging families consistently throughout the state for those states that may have systems of payments with family fees, or not having the resources available throughout the state to have services available in different regions. And we also were coming back with a lot of issues around the lead agency's oversight of the local level requirements, such as child fines and the coordination of payer sources to ensure timely services. So from the initial DMS monitoring results, we kind of meshed together the system of payments and the methods, and we came out with the SLOR, the single line of responsibility protocol for DMS 2.0, in order to capture what was going on in states and in order for OSEP to best support lead agencies and to ensure compliance with IDEA. And now I'm going to pass it on to Danny Rice to introduce our single line of responsibility monitoring protocol.
Hi. So I just wanted to say it's important to note that OSEP created 2 documents for the single line of responsibility. The first document is an introduction to the single line protocol, and the second is the actual protocol. I'm going to briefly discuss the introduction as Charlie will discuss the protocol after me. So as you know from completing your annual grant application under Section 2B13, states are required to sign an assurance that a statewide, comprehensive, coordinated, multidisciplinary interagency system includes a lead agency that is designated by the governor and has a single line of responsibility for ensuring IDA Part C requirements. While these requirements can be found both in the IDA statute and regulations, the requirements under 303.120 are really useful to look at in understanding the requirements that fall under the single line of responsibility. The single line requirement is so important because it speaks to the state's necessity of having a strong general supervision system and gives lead agencies both the authority and responsibility to have fiscal policies and procedures to verify compliance, issue findings of non-compliance, and take appropriate enforcement actions where required. Next slide. So one thing we know is that no 2 Part C programs are the same. This is something we say a lot in the Part C field. The IDA Part C does allow states flexibility in implementing the Part C program in accordance with state law and administrative policies, so long as the EIS programs meet federal statutory and regulatory requirements. As a result of this flexibility, OSEP sees a wide variety of approaches in how lead agencies contract with EIS programs and providers. OSEP notes that many lead agencies utilize complex systems for contracting or otherwise arranging for EI services and accessing multiple payer sources to fund those services. Other state lead agencies exercise their general supervision authority with an emphasis on local control or have complex rulemaking processes for developing and implementing policies and procedures related to the oversight of Part C functions and activities. These varied approaches and systems present challenges to state lead agencies in meeting the requirements for a single line of responsibility and increase the risk of non-compliance with Part C, fiscal, and other requirements. During phase one of DMS 2.0, OSEP will review each state's general supervision system to ensure the lead agency has effective fiscal policies and procedures. And during phase two, OSEP will review documentation of how states implement those policies and procedures. OSEP will also provide technical assistance and support to lead agencies related to state administrative, fiscal, and other related systems to identify model practices for implementation of these requirements and related general supervision activities, including how lead agencies provide fiscal oversight of its EIS programs and providers. While not required, some states find it helpful to use the protocol as a self-assessment tool to identify areas for improvement. Now I'll move it on to Charlie. Thanks.
All right. So thanks, Danny. I think I want to address the 800-pound gorilla in the room just quickly before I move on to a walkthrough of the different components of the SLOR. And I think in this case, it's not the 800-pound gorilla, it's the 14-page monitoring protocol. And that's to say that we understand as you look through that protocol, it looks overwhelming. As Danny mentioned, we know we have complex systems. We've tried to develop a tool that will address any configuration that might be thrown at us. And we know that's going to be a difficult task. We know there's still things that we probably didn't anticipate. But I do want to reassure you that it is not our intention, A, for anyone to complete this protocol as part of this process. I want to make it clear also that not all parts of the protocol are necessarily going to be used with states. And I also want to acknowledge that there's duplication across the different segments. And then there's a reason for that. So as you look at this protocol, you may notice that similar items across different sections. Part of that's because of the regulations, but also part of that's because each one of the sections is intended to potentially serve as a standalone protocol that we may use. So based on the specifics of your state and some research that we do, we're going to probably hone in on one of the areas that I'm about to cover, and maybe a combination of different areas. Based on, again, the specifics of the state. So this is really intended to be tailored. And again, as you look at it, the hope is that you don't feel overwhelmed with it, that you are reassured that we're going to have conversations with you that will sort of drive the real focus of the monitoring over time. As I like to call it, either like a Swiss Army knife, or with a tool for just about everything. Again, I think Danny mentioned this, but phase one, right? We're going to be looking at this protocol from the level of policies, procedures, and systems. Coming back to you in phase two, a little down the road, to talk about the actual implementation of those policies and procedures and documents supporting that. So what you should have is sort of a phased approach where we have a discussion that's higher level related to what you say you do, right, as a system, and then sort of evidences of what that looks like. I would also point out, so it doesn't surprise anybody, that we're very much fans of having a local component to this monitoring. What that is intended to do, obviously, is not serve as a monitoring of your local program, but to give us a sense from their perspective what different aspects of the single line of responsibility, or in the case of Part B, the subrecipient monitoring looks like from that subrecipient's perspective. So again, as time moves on, that's clearly like more of a phase two activity where we're talking about interviews and talking points with folks, but that is something that we like to do. So just full transparency. Okay, next slide. So again, based on general information that we know about the state, reviews of documents that we already have available, like your APR submissions, your grant submissions, we will be starting to complete this single line of responsibility on our own, and then determining sort of where those gaps are, where we might need, what aspects might have policies that we might request during phase one. I like to use the single line responsibility as a communication tool that's completely up to the state and at your comfort. But typically what I'll do is, create a column for states to respond, 2 questions from us for us to make notes about different things that we've seen in the policies and ask follow-up questions. So if that's a style of communication that you would find helpful, you can talk to your fiscal facilitator, whoever's working with you on this, about what that communication is going to look like. again, so based on that information, that general information, we're determining. So we've got the first 3 sections up here. We may determine based on the fact that we know that a Part C system does pass through IDEA Part C funds to early intervention service programs. We might focus in on, let's just say, section number 1. So again, what you'll see in section 1 is a description of the structure of the state, what types of providers you have, how many, sort of give us an idea of the complexity of the state, a lot of things like that. So let's see, again, and so along with that, we're looking for the lead agency's oversight, right, of the use of Part C funds a little more specifically in this one. We'll get into section 2, which applies to everybody, but along with that, there'd be that additional level of review just in how the IDEA Part C funds are being spent. That may be on services. If so, you can imagine there are other sections where we're going to talk about things like pay or last resort. That would be sort of a section 1 review would be for those states that do pass through funding, IDEA Part C funds to locals. Section 2, these are the requirements whether or not the programs, the activities are administered by, by the agency, right? So this could be, another agency, it could be your contracted vendors, it could be, local programs or school districts, whoever's providing those services. The expectation is obviously that they continue to meet Part C programmatic and fiscal requirements. So you'll see a lot of overlap in this section, I think, with other programmatic things that we're likely to be talking to you about. If child find activities are performed at a local level, there's obviously potentially a funding issue there. Part C funds are being passed down for that purpose, but there's also the programmatic purposes as well. So what I would say is both monitoring protocols are intended to be a little more integrated into OSEP's broader monitoring initiatives right now. I'll move on to section 3 then as well. Again, the emphasis here you'll notice is on things like pay or last resort. A lot of times with this section, we also do end up talking about your system of payments. So Susan mentioned that was one of our earlier protocols. It still tends to get a workout, I think, when we go to states, just to take a look at it from 2 perspectives. One, implementing, how do you implement your system of payments? But also it has to do with that single line of responsibility aspect of, do you have the authority? Are you monitoring to make sure that your early intervention service programs are implementing that system of payments in accordance with your procedures? Okay, next slide. And section 4, this one, I would emphasize with this sort of the importance of those intra and interagency disputes. Again, in instances where you do have different payer sources and it's unclear if you have a denial, something like that, our greatest interest, both fiscal and programmatic, is that there's not a delay or interruption in service, right? So these are going to be the primary things that we look for here. But then we'd like to look at the process and see how it works. If you're a state that accesses Medicaid and there are issues or denials, things like that, we would want to have that conversation both with you at the state but also at the local level, what that's like, and make sure that there's a process to go through for that program to receive interim payment if necessary, to make sure that those services aren't delayed, but also to be reimbursed and have the program reimbursed, the Part C funds being reimbursed at a later date when the payer source is ultimately decided. So, all right, well, next slide. Okay, so we're just gonna briefly go over some resources that you have here. And then I believe we're gonna turn this over to our Part B counterparts. So Susan and Jennifer.
And before we get to them, I just want to highlight that we'll be answering the questions at the end of their presentation. I've been answering you, but I want to share those more broadly. So with that, we'll kick it over to Jennifer Finch.
All right. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Finch, and I am a member of the Fiscal Implementation Team. And for the remainder of the presentation, Susan Murray and I will be talking about the Part B Subrecipient Monitoring under DMS 2.0. And I want to say before we kind of kick off and get into it, unlike the single line of responsibility protocol that we just talked through with Charlie and Susan and Danny, the Part B subrecipient monitoring protocol is not a new one. This is a protocol that we've used now for a number of years with a number of states. And what we tend to do is make tweaks along the way as necessary. But just as Charlie mentioned earlier, you are not required to complete the protocol, but you can use it to assess the overall health of your state system, regardless of where you are within our monitoring cycle. Next slide. All right, so let's talk generally about the major regulations. So when we look at subrecipient monitoring, we look at it through the lens of these major regulations. The SEA responsibility for general supervision is the major authority as it encompasses the overall accountability system within your state. We couple that with your state's monitoring activities and enforcement activities as well. And so those two IDEA regulations are layered with the requirements under the uniform guidance for pass-through entities through monitoring and reporting performance. So these are the major requirements. Later on, Susan will get into the details of other specific requirements that are covered throughout the protocol. Next slide. So why do we do it? There are several reasons why we chose subrecipient monitoring as a whole, but specifically for DMS 2.0. First and foremost, you know, when you administer $1.5 billion, and that's billion with a B, it becomes your fiduciary responsibility, right? To ensure that the program requirements are being carried out. And also with the inception of the uniform guidance came the requirement to conduct risk assessments. And so at that time, what we had to do was revise our monitoring and revise our fiscal monitoring to make those accommodations and to accommodate these areas. And in turn, states also revised their monitoring systems as well. So, and what the uniform guidance did was it also changed the way we looked at monitoring activities. And one example of that is where we see technical assistance included as one of the range of potential monitoring activities. Lastly, we chose the subrecipient monitoring protocol specifically because for Part B, it's a nice accompaniment to the Part C single line of responsibility, which includes general supervision. So there is good congruence between the two protocols. Next slide. All right, so when we run the protocols, when we sit with you and have discussions, whether on-site, virtual, when we talk with you in the first phase of our process, we aim to have a collaborative discussion with SEA staff, with the necessary fiscal SEA staff, and to talk through the monitoring through the lens of the uniform guidance. What we find in a lot of states is that the fiscal monitoring is done through several different program offices. So it's important that you include appropriate persons from these different program areas into the conversations so that a complete and accurate picture of what you do in your state is conveyed. Next slide. All right. So through our subrecipient monitoring discussions, we first review the requirements. And again, Susan will go over those requirements later on in the slides. We discuss your state's monitoring system, and the green star is an indication that that's one of our new tweaks that we've added to the protocol. But we included discussions about the OSEP and how the SIMR and the SIP and subrecipient monitoring can be aligned, and if they are aligned in your states, and how they're aligned to the goal of improving outcomes for students with disabilities. So that's one of the new tweaks we made. We discuss and identify best practices in the field, and we are always looking to educate ourselves as to what's going on in the field and what's going on in states. We often get asked if there are samples. We often get asked what other states are doing. So this gives us a good opportunity to review state artifacts and to share them. And our purpose is not to make findings. However, if we identify gaps between your state system and the requirements, or if we identify non-compliance, we make findings and we also work with you through correction. Next slide. So the protocol is divided into 4 major parts, right? And this is in addition to the background. And I would encourage you, once you're reviewing the protocol, to read the background, because as it provides good information. But the first section, section 1, lays out the requirements under the uniform guidance, again, that Susan will be reviewing with you. Section 2 has questions listed that get at the heart of your state's monitoring system. And it also explores your monitoring practices. Section 3 includes questions about your single audit responsibilities. And this is one of the areas where we see the importance of including appropriate staff from other program areas. And the last section, section 4, is that newer section that we tweaked for this round of DMS, which focuses around improved outcomes. And here we hope to have a discussion about your SIP and your state SIMR and discuss how IDA funds are used to support these efforts. So next, I will turn the presentation over to Susan to discuss the requirements, the specific requirements with you in more detail. Susan?
Jennifer, thanks so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Jennifer's already reviewed with you the 4 components of the subrecipient monitoring protocol. And so as your state's OSEP monitoring team works through this protocol with you, or as you work through it as kind of a self-study or self-assessment tool, you'll become at least somewhat familiar with all 4 of those components that Jennifer referenced. But in the interest of time, my job today is to take a few minutes to review with you some key aspects of one section, and that's the section related to subrecipient monitoring requirements under the uniform guidance that's showing on the screen right now. And again, this is focused on Part B, so I'm talking primarily to and about state education agencies in this section. And just to begin with, if you need to access a copy of the uniform guidance regulations, which of course apply to all federal agencies and their grantees and not just to the education department and our grantees, then the citation that you can search for is 2 CFR 200. And beyond that, the specific citation that we're referring to today in this section of our protocol is 2 CFR 200.331, in case you want to make a note of that. And in the language in this section of the uniform guidance, you, that is your SEA, are referred to as a pass-through entity, which is pretty self-explanatory. OSEP grants IDEA Part B funds to you, the SEA, and most of those funds are in turn passed through to the eligible LEAs in your state. As you know, this is not optional. It's a requirement that you pass through most of these funds. And as Charlie explained, it looks a little different for the few of you who have what's called a Unitary system. But regardless, every SEA maintains the fiduciary responsibility for the funds that Jennifer earlier referred to. And then also in this section, your LEAs are referred to as subrecipients. Again, self-explanatory, but again, critically important as to why we are looking at your role as the pass-through entity to ensure that the subrecipient of those funds, or the LEAs that receive an IDEA subgrant from you, are using those funds consistent with the federal requirements. So we look to IDEA for some of the requirements you need to monitor your LEAs, but for right now, we're not talking about IDEA Part B requirements, but about additional requirements that you are responsible for under the uniform guidance. And so when you look at this 2 CFR 200.331 section, it starts with the words, all pass-through entities must. And then it's like, hold on to your hat, because it's really a full page of things that SEAs must do. There is a tiny bit of may in this section, and there's a lot of flexibility in the uniform guidance in various sections. But this particular area that we're going through now is mostly stated as a must. And so as you'll see on this slide, the words again that this starts off with include a must. But so item A actually represents a list of 6 items and then kind of a sub list of 13 additional items that need to all be included on your grant award notifications, or whatever the equivalent of that is called in your state. Whenever you issue IDEA subgrants or revise them or maybe supplement them, it's part of your specific responsibility under the uniform guidance to include all this information. And so it's part of our responsibility to be sure that you're doing so. And then item B here gets into your risk assessment, which we'll discuss with you as part of this review process under DMS, and we'll request information about that. Could you go to the next slide, please? Item D gets at your actual monitoring of LEAs to ensure compliance with the various authorities and responsibilities. And there's a list of 3 musts under this item. And so we'll be checking as part of this process to help document that you actually are carrying out these responsibilities. And then item E here, again, is focused on your risk assessment process. So the must of the uniform guidance from that item B we talked about on the previous slide is that you must do a risk assessment. But the may is that neither we nor the regulations can tell you what you need to include in your risk assessment, how or when you need to do it. So we will we want to make sure that you are assessing risk, and then really what we want to do is learn about how you're doing it, what your processes are for doing something with the information, the different risk factors you're looking at. And this relates to those best practices that Jennifer mentioned that we identify across states, and it also will help our monitoring teams inform our overall review of your state systems and structures. Next slide, please. Item F refers us to the audit requirements that actually have their own section in the uniform guidance. So we'll seek some verification that every LEA is audited as required, and then the additional requirements in sections G and H here on this same page as well. So that gives you some idea of the requirements that we'll be looking for information about in this part of the protocol. And as your MSIP team goes through this process with you, some of it will require some level of paper trail that we'll be requesting some information and documentation from you about. And some of it will be based on our discussion with you or information that we already have access to. And we take the TA, technical assistance portion of this work really equally important. And we really look forward to providing any additional information that we can that you feel like you may be in need of about fiscal systems and how best to implement those. Next slide. We finally just want to be sure that, that you know where the protocol and some of our related information is housed, as well as some of the TA resources available to you. And so, as has been mentioned, again, this is intended not only for those of you who are Cohort 1 states and who are already in or will soon be starting to be in discussion with us about this protocol, but also universal TA for all states. And if it's helpful to you to, use the protocol as a self-assessment in preparation for your own upcoming review a little further down the road. And the next slide, we just wanted to be sure you know who we are, who OSEP's fiscal staff are, and to know that we look forward to working with you over the next months and then even throughout the next couple of years in this full process on this protocol, as well as in related fiscal matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Well, we have a couple of questions in the chat that we're going to talk through and pose here. I just want to highlight to everybody, if you do have questions, to go ahead and type those into the question area, which is on your right hand. I think it's on your right, maybe. And also, I wanted to draw everyone's attention to, there is a handout. So on your panel listing, you should see something that says handout. That is a PDF copy of the presentation that we've just given here today. That was a couple of the questions that was coming up in the chat box. I also want to highlight that we will be holding these DMS 2.0 TA calls the 4th Thursday of every month at 4 p.m. We'll be covering the various topics of our 8 key components throughout that time, as well as some process and other topics related to our DMS work. I will also highlight that outside of that schedule, beginning right in November, we're going to be doing the 3rd Thursday, and in December, the 3rd Thursday due to the holidays. So I just want to highlight that. So our first question from the chat will go to the Part C folks. And we had somebody ask about the difference between the SLOR protocol and our previously used critical elements analysis guide, the CRAIG. What are the differences? So Charlie, Susan, or Danny, if you could address that question, that would be great.
This is Charlie. I can take a stab at this. It's funny, I haven't looked at the CRAIG in a very long time, so I don't really want to misspeak here. But I think this is more focused. I really have to go back and refresh my memory on the CRAIG and the different elements of the CRAIG. It's possible that single line of responsibility was examined at that point, but I doubt very seriously at this level of detail. And again, at the different levels. So really, we're going to look not just at policy level, but at implementation of some of the different components. I don't know if there's Susan or Danny, if you guys have any better recollection of the CRAIG for us just right off the bat, but I would start there, and if there are further questions, just obviously you can call any of us.
Yeah. And the next question related to that was about these protocols. So Charlie had mentioned one of the questions was, is this 14-page for all of the components, or is this just related to the Part C or Part B fiscal monitoring? For each of the key components, we will have a separate protocol. Those will all be posted on that web page that we've emailed out. That was in the letter. I'll make sure it gets in the chat here as well. But it was on the last slide that we had. All of our DMS protocols will be posted there. So the next ones that will be going up is the integrated monitoring and sustaining compliance and improvement. So those are 2 separate protocols. Not all of them will be 14 pages. They're all going to vary in length, and they may look a little different. So that's that. Another question that we had in the chat was for the Part C protocol, could OSEP explain what it means by geographic equity? So Charlie, if you want to take a stab at that, we can also follow up offline, but just off the top, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is one where I would encourage folks to give us a call if they want to chat about any state specifics. But I think really for me, the tie-in here is to a statewide system. And what I think, just like, you know, programs would like to see, we'd like to see states ensuring that the experience of a family, you know, when they access the system is the same, regardless, you know, what point of entry they come in through, but that they have a similar child find experience through referral and assessment. Service provision would be fairly even and based on the needs of the child and not based on the geography within the state. I think that to me would be just sort of a summary of what we're looking for there. And feel free to, you know, type it in the chat as well if there's a follow-up to that question.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question that's about, will the phase 1 schedule of DMS change each year, or is this what will be used going forward? At this point, this is what we're going to be using going forward. But that being said, at the end of this first phase, we may look at some of the components. We may think about what worked, what didn't, talk with you, the states and stakeholders, the groups that are in this first cohort, and there may be some adjustments. But our hope is to kind of get into a cycle and of our work and hopefully make that stick. So hopefully that answers. I know it's kind of a yes and a little bit maybe a no, but hopefully that helps. Let's see, I think there was one question about the Part B protocol. Is this a new version of the Part B subrecipient monitoring protocol? And if so, what are the major changes? I believe this is the same subrecipient monitoring protocol that we have been using in the past, but Susan and Jennifer, were there any updates or revisions to that? What was posted?
Yeah, so it is the same subrecipient monitoring protocol that we have used in the past, and I believe it was on slide 19. The only change or tweak that we did has the big green star, where we've added conversations about your state's SIP and the SIMR and how your fiscal system can support those efforts. So that's the only tweak that we made this year. But for the most part, it's the same protocol.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Another question, are additional supports and training available now at OSEP TA centers? We are actively working with the OSEP TA centers. I believe both ECTA and NCSI are hosting some cohort 1 technical assistance activities. I believe ECTA held theirs last week, and we'll be collaborating with them on updated tools that might support the work that we're doing. They also have a wealth of evaluation tools, resources related to a state evaluating their general supervision system. So we will be working closely with them and sharing that information out to you all through your state leads on what information is coming out from there. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any. I think we've addressed most. Yeah, so one question is, when can cohort 1 states expect to receive all of the protocols? We will be posting them as quickly as we can as we roll out this system. I believe the integrated monitoring and sustaining compliance and improvement one, we hope to post in December so that it would be ready, or at least you'd have some time to look at it prior to the January work that we're beginning. But again, keeping in mind that OSEP will be kind of taking the first pass at it for this year. We recognize that states are anxious and would like to see those protocols, and we're getting them ready for you as quickly as we can. So there will be more information coming on that on next month's call. Will the phase 1 schedule of DMS change? Oh, I did that one, sorry. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Let me just make sure. There was one question about our October 15th TA call. I believe that will be posted soon. I was texting with our in-office person, and it doesn't look like it's been posted yet, but it should be soon. So keep an eye out for that. Again, our DMS presentation that we just gave today is available right now in the handout section. So are there any other questions? Any hands up, Jen? I don't see any.
No hands up. Just so you know, I know that for the question that came in about the October 15th call, all of the information from the call from the 15th, as well as the call from today, will be posted on the OSEP Ideas That Work website. All you have to do is go into the resources for grantees. You'll find it under the Monitoring and State Improvement Planning page. On this page, we have a link for the OSEP National TA calls and related resources. So any additional special calls like the call this month will go here. And you'll always be able to find out information and registration information for upcoming calls, as well as links to the previous presentations. The 2 calls from October will be posted later today.
And we did get a question in the chat about be posted, and that was perfect timing, Jen. Thank you for sharing that. And so I don't think we see any other questions. We just really want to thank you so much for your time, your collaboration, your participation with OSEP as we roll out this exciting new process. We are very much looking forward to working with you and working on DMS 2.0. So everyone have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you again next month. Thank you. Bye.